Welcome to this bonus episode of The Faithful Citizen. Today we're stepping away from our usual rhythm to share a special essay, Broken Pedestals, the Church, its Titans, and the Cost of Silence. It's a hard look at how the Church has enshrined its so-called heroes and the price we've paid for protecting their legacies instead of telling the truth. Let's dive in. In recent years and months, we've watched the passing of so-called Titans of the Faith. Their obituaries are written in glowing terms, their legacies protected, their pulpits remembered with reverence. The Church rushes to preserve their memory, draping their names in honor as if the truth itself might sully the gospel. But for many of us, their legacies aren't triumphs to be celebrated. They're wounds we still carry in our minds, bodies, and souls. We are told it's not the time to speak, that we must not speak ill of the dead. But the Church has been saying that for centuries. Silence has always been its shield, bearing harm under heaps of praise. That silence is how Jonathan Edwards' ownership of enslaved children could be reframed as a mere cultural blind spot. It's how George Whitefield's lobbying to legalize slavery in Georgia is excused as a tragic inconsistency. It's how Robert Dabney, the theologian of the Confederacy, is still quoted for his piety while his white supremacy is left unmentioned. It's how James Dobson, who taught generations that discipline, hierarchy, and punishment were God's design for the family, is remembered as a defender of the home. At the same time, those same teachings bear fruit in a politics of fear. Enough. Faithfulness isn't pretending that harm didn't happen. Faithfulness refuses to canonize men who left trails of broken people behind them in the name of God's design. If the Church can't reckon honestly with the damage done in the name of Christ, it will continue to perpetuate that same damage in His name. The truth is that these so-called titans weren't merely flawed men shaped by their times. They were architects of theological, cultural, and political systems that sanctified oppression. They built pedestals for themselves and were enshrined on them by a church that prized reputation over repentance. And today their ideas still echo. In seminaries that sanitize their legacies, in churches that silence victims for the sake of order, and in a political movement that confuses authoritarian power with godly leadership. If the gospel is to mean anything in an age of fracture, the Church must tell the truth. It must dismantle its pedestals, confront its idols, and choose honesty over hagiography. Only then can it bear faithful witness, not to the greatness of its heroes, but to the glory of the one who alone is without blemish. The Church has always had its heroes, men remembered as giants, defenders of the truth, guardians of orthodoxy. Their portraits hang in seminaries, their names are inscribed on lecture halls, and their sermons are still quoted from pulpits. But beneath their legacies lies a more complicated truth. These titans built their platforms not apart from oppression, but often on its very foundation. The Church, instead of telling the truth, chose to enshrine them on pedestals, creating saints without sainthood and idols cloaked in theology. Jonathan Edwards, the towering figure of the First Great Awakening, is often remembered as the preacher of sinners in the hands of an angry God, but far less is said about his ownership of enslaved people. In 1741, Edwards purchased a 14-year-old girl named Venus. In a chilling irony, he later scribbled sermon notes on the back of her bill of sale. For Edwards, this wasn't a contradiction. His theology allowed him to defend slavery as part of God's providential order. And yet today, he's still hailed as a spiritual giant. His slaveholding is dismissed as a blind spot, rather than recognized as a deliberate moral and theological choice. George Whitefield, Edwards' contemporary and one of the most famous evangelists of the 18th century, presents an equally troubling legacy. Early in his ministry, he condemned the cruelty of Southern slaveholders in a fiery letter. But by the mid-1740s, Whitefield himself was lobbying for slavery's legalization in Georgia, not because he believed in slavery as just, but because he needed enslaved labor to fund his orphanage. In doing so, Whitefield became one of the most effective advocates for slavery's expansion in colonial America. His orphanage and ministry were built, quite literally, on the backs of enslaved people. A century later, Robert Louis Dabney carried this legacy into the era of the Civil War. A Presbyterian theologian and Confederate chaplain, Dabney became one of the South's fiercest defenders of slavery. He argued that it wasn't only a social necessity, but a biblical mandate ordained by God for the order of society. After the war, Dabney championed segregation and white supremacy, giving theological cover to the lost cause mythology. Today, Dabney's name is still cited in reform circles for his doctrinal precision, while his racism is conveniently reframed as a regrettable product of his times. Fast forward to the present, and the pattern continues. John MacArthur, who we discussed in a previous episode, was one of the most prominent evangelical pastors of the late 20th and early 21st century, insisted that Christianity doesn't promise equal social rights, nor does it exist to disrupt social orders. He dismissed systemic racism as a myth, preferring a colorblind theology that ignores centuries of structural injustice. His theology echoes the same frameworks that once defended slavery and segregation: order above justice, hierarchy above equality. And then there's James Dobson. While Edwards and Whitefield defended slavery, Dobson became the architect of a new kind of authoritarianism. Through Focus on the Family, his best-selling books, and his radio broadcasts, Dobson taught that God's design for the family was rooted in discipline, hierarchy, and punishment. To rebel against a parent was, in his words, to rebel against God. Parents were urged to equate discipline with discipleship, often through corporal punishment. Children were told to equate obedience with godliness. Fear and hierarchy were baptized as divine order. This theology didn't remain confined to the home. It discipled a generation into believing that submission to authority was holy, rebellion was sin, and punishment was righteous. And so, when strongmen politicians rose promising to restore order through fear, many evangelicals recognized the voice. They had already heard it in their living rooms. From Edwards's enslaved servants to Whitefield's lobbying, from Dabney's white supremacy to MacArthur's denial of systemic injustice, and from Dobson's authoritarian family theology to today's politics, the pattern is clear. The church hasn't merely tolerated flawed men. It has enshrined them, built pedestals for them, and called them heroes while ignoring the damage they left behind. The church has always known how to keep its heroes untouchable. When confronted with their sins, it pleads context. When faced with their abuses, it pleads timing. And when asked to tell the truth, it pleads silence. Not now. Not the right time. Don't speak ill of the dead. But silence is never neutral. Silence is often a form of protection for the powerful, safeguarding legacies and institutions. And every time the church chooses silence, the cost is borne by those already wounded. Consider the way memory is selectively preserved. Edwards is remembered for his theology of revival. At the same time, the enslaved girl Venus, whose life he purchased for 80 pounds, is forgotten, her name buried in the footnotes of history. Whitefield is praised for preaching to tens of thousands, while the fact that his orphanage was built on enslaved labor is quietly brushed aside. Dabney is still quoted in reform circles for doctrinal clarity, his open white supremacy reframed as an unfortunate blind spot. Even Dobson, who taught generations of Christians that discipline, hierarchy, and punishment were God's design for the family, is remembered as a champion of the family. At the same time, the testimonies of children raised in fear under his teachings remain hidden. Selective memory isn't simply dishonesty, it's complicity. By telling only half the story, the church continues to canonize men whose hands were not clean. Institutions have played a part in preserving these legacies. Southern Seminary, for example, once issued apologies for inviting Martin Luther King Jr. to speak, not apologizing for racism, but for offending segregationists. Publishers and evangelical media outlets turned Dobson into a household name, while refusing to amplify critiques or survivor testimonies that challenge his model. Churches have learned well how to protect themselves, but in doing so, they've silenced those crying out for justice. The result is a cycle where victims are silenced and legacies preserved. Frederick Douglass once described American Christianity as a thin veil to cover up crimes, and his words still echo today. Survivors of abuse, racism, or authoritarian parenting are told their wounds must not overshadow the good these men did. To question the legacy of Edwards, Whitefield, or Dobson is to risk being branded divisive, unfaithful, or disloyal to the gospel. And so the church has taught generation after generation that truth-telling is dangerous, but hagiography is holy. This cycle of silence has repeated itself for centuries. Silence around slavery allowed it to flourish unchecked. Silence around segregation and Jim Crow kept churches complicit in racial terror. Silence around authoritarian parenting created generations more loyal to order than to justice. Each time the cost of silence has been borne by the vulnerable, each time the witness of Christ has been sacrificed to protect the reputation of men. And as long as silence remains the church's shield, it will continue to sanctify abusers, silence victims, and perpetuate injustice in his name. Ideas never remain confined to the family. The patterns we establish in our homes become the patterns we replicate in our churches, our communities, and ultimately in our politics. Dobson understood the power of the household, but the theology he promoted did more than shape parenting strategies. It also influenced the broader culture. It discipled a generation into believing that submission to authority was holy, that rebellion was sin, and that punishment was righteous. For decades, millions of Christians were told that discipline, hierarchy, and control weren't just practical necessities, but God's very design for family life. But when obedience to parental authority is equated with obedience to God, authoritarianism ceases to look like abuse and begins to look like faithfulness. Fear becomes love, punishment becomes discipleship, and hierarchy becomes a path to spiritual growth and holiness. Those raised in this framework learned to see order as godliness, even when that order came at the expense of justice, tenderness, or truth. The result isn't merely broken families, but a broken political imagination, one where authoritarian leaders can be embraced as protectors of God's order. Dobson himself was never shy about linking faith and politics. He urged Christians to see voting as a moral duty, casting pro-family candidates as the only faithful choice. Through his vast media platform, he helped mobilize evangelicals into a powerful political bloc, one that could tip elections and reshape national policy. But beneath the surface of that mobilization lay the same theology he preached in the home: obedience, hierarchy, and fear. Politicians who promised to restore order, punish rebellion, and defend family values resonated with believers because they sounded so familiar. They were echoing the voice they had already heard around their kitchen tables. The seeds sown in the home have borne fruit in the nation. A generation raised under Dobson's vision has become a movement willing to sanctify authoritarian power in exchange for promises of stability. This is why the same churches that once applauded corporal punishment now rally behind leaders who equate dissent with rebellion, power with righteousness, and domination with faithfulness. The authoritarian family became the training ground for authoritarian politics. And yet, as with Edwards, Whitefield, and Dabney before him, the church has chosen silence over truth. Dobson is remembered as the defender of the family, while the authoritarian legacy he left behind continues to shape both homes and governments. But faithfulness can't mean silence. If the church can't honestly reckon with Dobson's teachings and their political consequences, then it'll remain complicit in perpetuating harm not only in households but across the nation. For every titan the church enshrined, some prophets refused to bow to silence. They weren't always celebrated in their lifetimes. Many were despised, slandered, and even threatened with violence. Yet their voices bear witness to what faithfulness looks like when truth is chosen over reputation and justice over order. Douglas, himself once enslaved, denounced the Christianity of his day as hypocrisy. In his famous 1852 address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" he declared that American Christianity was a thin veil to cover up crimes. Douglas didn't mince words. He saw clearly what many pulpits refused to admit, that the gospel proclaimed in white churches had been corrupted into a tool for oppression. While preachers like Whitefield were lobbying for the expansion of slavery, Douglas was exposing the church's complicity and demanding that its people reckon with the truth. Charles Spurgeon, the famed London preacher, likewise refused to sanctify silence. He called slavery a crime of crimes, a soul-destroying sin, and an iniquity which cries aloud for vengeance. He refused fellowship with slaveholders, declaring that he would as soon share communion with a murderer as with a man-stealer. His sermons and letters on the subject were so uncompromising that Southerners in America publicly burned his writings, and newspapers published threats against his life. Yet Spurgeon wouldn't back down, insisting that the gospel demanded truth, even if it cost him an audience. A century later, Billy Graham stood in segregated America and chose a different path than many of his white contemporaries. He personally tore down ropes dividing white and black audiences at his crusades, insisting that Christianity is not a white man's religion. He paid bail for Martin Luther King Jr. and refused to hold crusades in South Africa unless they were integrated. Graham's record isn't without flaws. He often sidestepped confrontation with racial injustice, but his refusal to perpetuate segregation marked a costly witness in an era when silence was easier. And through it all, the black church carried a prophetic witness that white churches largely abandoned. From hush harbors on plantations to the pulpits of civil rights leaders, black Christians preserved a faith that refused to be silenced. They sang songs of liberation when enslavers demanded obedience. They preached justice when white preachers demanded order. They carried the truth of the gospel when others buried it under power and privilege. These voices remind us that faithfulness has always been possible, but rarely from the pedestals. It's been the prophets, the marginalized, the despised, who bore the most faithful witness to Christ. Where the church chose silence, they chose truth. Where the church defended its heroes, they defended the vulnerable. And their words still echo, calling us to break the cycle of complicity and speak the truth, whatever the cost. The church isn't entirely silent today. In recent decades, some institutions have begun to admit the truth, long buried beneath memorial plaques and hallowed obituaries. In 1995, the Southern Baptist Convention issued a resolution on racial reconciliation, acknowledging and repenting for its roots in slavery and segregation. In 2018, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary released a report confessing that its founders were all enslavers who defended slavery as biblical. These moments of confession matter. They demonstrate that truth-telling is possible, that institutions can begin to reckon with their histories, however belatedly. And yet, even these confessions are often partial and tightly controlled. They acknowledge the past while leaving current injustices largely untouched. A statement of regret costs little when systems of inequality remain intact. It's easier to apologize for slavery than to confront the structural racism that still shapes churches, seminaries, and politics. It's easier to distance ourselves from the sins of dead men than to confront the living legacies their theology still upholds. Denial remains a powerful force. In recent years, political leaders have openly sought to minimize the horrors of slavery, with some insisting that the nation has focused too much on its brutality. Evangelical leaders echo this minimization by insisting that systemic racism is a myth or that discussions of equity are unbiblical. Christian nationalism, with its call to restore America to a mythic past, thrives precisely because the church has refused to tell the whole truth about that past. The same silence that once shielded Edwards and Whitefield now shields politicians who sanctify order over justice and power over truth. Dobson's legacy is evident here. His theology of discipline, hierarchy, and fear wasn't just about family life. It became the seedbed of a political imagination that sees authoritarian power as holy. The children raised under his teachings are now adults who see strongman leaders as protectors of God's design. The reflex to equate obedience with faith and dissent with rebellion has carried over from the household to the ballot box. This is why so many evangelicals remain fiercely loyal to leaders who promise order through domination. The authoritarian family Dobson helped to sanctify has become the model for a despotic nation. The reckoning, then, is far from complete. Institutions confess selectively, leaders double down on denial, and Dobson's shadow lingers in the way politics and faith intertwine. For all the talk of reconciliation, the church has yet to choose complete honesty. Instead, it continues to cling to its pedestals, fearing that if its heroes fall, the faith itself will crumble. But the opposite is true. Only when the idols are toppled can the witness of Christ stand clear. If silence is complicity, then faithfulness must begin with truth. The church can't continue to bury the sins of its so-called titans under glowing eulogies and sanitized histories. It must tell the whole story. Edwards was both a brilliant theologian and a slaveholder. Whitefield both ignited a revival and lobbied for slavery's expansion. Dabney both defended doctrine and propagated white supremacy. Dobson both championed the family and discipled millions into authoritarian fear. To pretend otherwise isn't faithfulness. It's idolatry. But truth alone isn't enough. Truth must lead to repentance, and repentance must come at a cost. Empty resolutions and carefully worded statements can't heal wounds or dismantle legacies of harm. Faithful repentance requires tearing down pedestals, removing names from buildings, refusing to platform abusive leaders, and dismantling theological frameworks that sanctify hierarchy and domination. It means refusing to defend the reputations of the dead at the expense of the living. It means choosing the voices of survivors, the oppressed, and the marginalized over the comfort of institutions. At the same time, the church must broaden its imagination of who deserves to be honored. For too long, it celebrated enslavers while neglecting the enslaved, platformed segregationists while silencing those who suffered under segregation, and elevated authoritarian leaders while ignoring the prophets who opposed them. It's time to lift up different names. Lemuel Haynes, the first black ordained minister in America, who denounced slavery as incompatible with the gospel. Phyllis Wheatley, the enslaved poet whose faith and brilliance testified to the Imago Dei. Harriet Tubman, who risked everything to lead others to freedom. Martin Luther King Jr., who preached justice even from a Birmingham jail. It's time to learn from the Black church, which has carried the gospel's prophetic witness even when white churches abandoned it. Faithfulness also requires courage in the present. It's not enough to confess the sins of men long dead while refusing to confront the ideologies still alive in our pews and politics. The church must refuse complicity with Christian nationalism, reject attempts to sanitize slavery or deny systemic racism, and resist the authoritarian impulses that Dobson's theology helped to normalize. To remain silent in the face of these realities is to repeat the very cycle that's already cost generations their dignity, safety, and faith. Breaking the cycle won't be easy. It'll mean dismantling idols that have been worshipped for centuries. It'll mean confessing that many of the church's so-called heroes did as much harm as good. But this is the way of the gospel, not to preserve reputations, but to tell the truth, not to protect power, but to liberate the oppressed, not to defend idols, but to worship Christ alone. Only then can the church begin to repair its witness, and only then can it offer the world a vision of faith that's not corrupted by silence. The church has always been tempted to build pedestals for its heroes. Edwards, Whitefield, Dabney, MacArthur, and Dobson, each elevated as a titan of the faith, are remembered for their brilliance, influence, and reach. And yet beneath every glowing tribute lies a trail of harm. Enslaved children were bought and sold, and orphanages were built on the backs of the enslaved. Doctrines twisted to defend white supremacy. Families taught to confuse fear with love, punishment with discipleship, and authoritarianism with holiness. For centuries, the church has defended these men as if the gospel itself would collapse without them. It's protected their reputations while silencing their victims. It's buried their sins under praise, insisting that now is never the right time to tell the truth. But silence has never been faithfulness. Silence has only ever been complicity. Faithfulness doesn't mean preserving legacies. Faithfulness means telling the truth even when it topples our own idols. Faithfulness refuses to canonize men who built ministries and movements on the backs of the vulnerable. Faithfulness looks at the wreckage left behind and says, enough. The witness of Christ doesn't need Edwards's brilliance, Whitefield's charisma, Dabney's theology, MacArthur's platform, or Dobson's empire. The church doesn't need titans. It needs truth-tellers. It needs prophets who will speak against silence, even at significant cost. It requires people who will refuse to worship at the altar of reputation and instead bow before the one who alone is without blemish. If the gospel is to have credibility in this age of fracture, the church must choose honesty over hagiography, repentance over reputation, courage over comfort. It must tear down its pedestals, dismantle its idols, and bear faithful witness to Christ, not by protecting the names of its heroes, but by proclaiming the name above every name. Only then will the church's silence be broken. Only then will its witness be faithful. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of The Faithful Citizen. If this essay resonated with you, I invite you to sit with it, share it, and keep the conversation alive. Faithfulness doesn't mean silence. It means telling the truth, even when it costs us. Until next time, may we be a people who refuse to worship at broken pedestals and who bear witness to Christ above every name.